thank you for coming. I have to do a presentation on my research that I did for my master's class, and I did a lot of research on content literacy, and as you can see, it's a responsibility of everyone. I'm going to start you out with the imagine if situation. So imagine that you are in 5th grade sitting in science class, and your teacher tells you that because of the pep rally that we scheduled this afternoon, she's not going to have time to teach you the lesson on the classification system. Rather, she instructs you to take your book home and read the lesson on your own. So if you're in 5th grade and your teacher asks you to do this, would you be confident enough as a reader, or would you be one who would have difficulty reading the material to learn? Also, would you be able to decipher what's on those pages, or feel like it's an impossible mountain to climb? You'd be surprised at how many kids you ask to open a book and look at the information on the page, and they have no idea what the layout is. So you might be wondering why this is a concern. Well, our goal is to prepare our students for college and career, and that's one statement that the Common Core makes over and over, is we're trying to prepare them for a real world situation. Once we get into the real world, we need to learn how to read to get information, not just literary novels and stuff. Employers aren't going to be asking us to read fictional stories. They want us to be researchers, and they want us to be able to write in a non-fictional way. Nell K. Duke, she's one of the pioneers of content literacy research, and she points out that students are receiving very little instruction with informational text. She also states that our failure to develop adequate informational reading and writing skills in many students has long been recognized. Some scholars have even linked these failures to larger deficiencies in achievement. According to Moss, who's another researcher in this field, he says that teachers help students learn to read the world by providing them with literacy learning tools that will last a lifetime, and by developing the abilities that will allow students to not only survive, but also thrive in the technological age to come. This topic needs to be addressed for several different reasons. The first is Common Core state standards. This is something that we're being forced to implement come 2014. All the states are being pushed into it so that we have a common ground across the United States, not just each state with its own standards. One of the main focuses is to expose students to more complex informational text. Like I said earlier, we want our kids reading for information purposes and learning to read, or reading for learning purposes. Literacy skills are embedded within the core subjects, and each teacher needs to hold some responsibility. So it's not just the language teacher that needs to teach these skills, it's content specific. There's different literacy skills for each subject on learning how to read that material. This is what the research says. This portion, I had to research a lot of information out there and see what the researchers have gathered up already. And the definition that Swafford and Callis provided is that content area literacy is a cognitive and social practice involving the ability and desire to read, comprehend, critique, and write about multiple forms of print. These multiple forms of print include textbooks, novels, magazines, internet materials, and other socio-technical science systems conveying information, emotional content, and ideas to be considered from a critical stance. So you can see we want our kids being able to read a variety of information. So content literacy is not content knowledge. Content literacy is not a prerequisite of content knowledge. However, one must have content knowledge in order to become advanced in content literacy. So you have to have that background knowledge before you can become advanced in the literacy part of it. Here's some kind of shocking statistics. Fewer than 3% of 8th graders can analyze and extend information at a basic level. Why, do you ask? Well, there's a lack of experience with expository text in the school. Too many narratives are being used. If you look at a basal reader, almost all of the stories in the basal reader are fictional, and we need to expose them to more expository text. here's the ratios that are recommended using informational text. By 4th grade, it should be half informational and half literary. By 8th grade, 45% should be information, or should be literary, and 55% informational. And by the 12th grade, 70% of their reading should be coming from informational text. Here's a quick video clip on someone in the education department that's stating the same information.
The Common Core State Standards require elementary students to read a much greater volume of informational text than current. The standards require that students read and spend 50% of their time reading informational text and 50% time reading literature. This is going to be a welcome change for teachers and for students. When you think about the little ones, you know what sponges they are, how insatiable their desire is to learn all about the world, how it works. Elementary school teachers, though, have been faced with these expanded literacy blocks that have been dedicated mainly to stories, and these expanded math blocks. And by the time you put those two together, it is all but locked out a study in social studies, history, geography, science, the arts, and all the wonderful subjects that both teachers want to teach and students want to learn. The research tells us that only 7% of instructional reading time in elementary school and actually through middle school is spent on informational text. Compare that to what we know students are going to need to do when they graduate, which is spend about 80% of their time reading informational text. We also know that informational text structures are much tougher for students to get and understand. They're more variable than our narrative text structures. The standards then require a move from 7% of instructional reading time focused on informational text to 50%. And that is going to set elementary school teachers free to do what they've been wanting to do. I myself am an elementary school teacher, and that I know is going to be a welcome change.
So as you can see from what she said, she's stating the same thing, is that we need to bring more informational text into our classrooms. Research has shown that this has not been happening, and we're hoping to shift toward that it is happening. One way to support this idea is by stocking your classroom with a healthy variety of both types of text. You can keep the novels in there, but you need to start stocking up with like magazines or non-fictional stories, newspapers, any of those types of things where kids can look at the text and get information that's going to be helpful to them in the real world. The basal readers have their limitations, so one suggestion is to pair them up with outside material. Use your basal reader and then bring in supplemental. Informational text can ignite curiosities about the world and build vital reading and thinking skills. So we always think that kids just want to read those fun, cute little stories, but actually they are curious about things in the world. They want to learn, so we need to give them the opportunity to do so. One thing you need to do is boost their motivation. Their motivation stems from self-efficacy, and students make gains when given the choice. When you give them options of what they want to read or what they would prefer to read, they're naturally going to pick texts that are interesting to them. So you need to have a wide range. I just gave you guys some examples, and you need to provide instruction on how to comprehend informational text. All teachers. It's not just the reading teacher's job to teach reading skills. Like I said earlier, there's different ways of reading different types of material. Like in social studies, kids need to have skills on how to read, like those primary and secondary sources. In science, they need to know how to comprehend and understand the different text structures, like cause and effect and sequence of events or compare and contrast. So each teacher teacher needs to give the skills on how to read that type of information. Here's another quote from one of the researchers, Moss. He says that despite all the debate about the initial teaching and learning of reading, little attention seems to be paid to how children are to be assisted to become competent, independent readers of a variety of texts. We seem to assume that as children progress through the primary school and middle school, they transfer their ability to read narrative into competent reading of non-narrative, upon which much of their further education and capacity to deal with adult life will depend. So a lot of times when kids get into middle school, we just assume that they have those reading skills. Well, it doesn't necessarily transfer from narrative to expository. There's different styles and strategies that students need to read the different types of text. So here are some things that you can do in your classroom to support this idea. You need to provide effective instruction in each subject. One suggestion is a reading apprenticeship, which is basically what it says. You apprentice your students and you guide them and model and support how to read those types of texts. Sit down with them, give them instruction, show them how you do it, and then help them while they're on their own. A big component of Common Core is vocabulary. They stress working on vocabulary in all the subjects. There's different tiers of vocabulary, and if you go to the Common Core website and go to the Appendix A, you can find this information. But here's a handout of some descriptions of the different tiers. As you can see on the paper I gave you, there's 3 tiers of vocabulary. Tier 1 are words that are just everyday speech that are usually learned in the early grades, and they're not necessarily ones that we focus a lot of our instructional time on. They're basically like the sight word type vocabulary. Tier 2 words are what the standards refer to as general academic words, and they're far more likely to appear in written text than in speech. They appear in all sorts of text, informational text, words such as relative, vary, formulate, specifically, and accumulate. So these are highly generalizable words. Now the Tier 3 words are what the standards refer to as domain specific. These are specific to a domain or a field of study. So if you're in science class, you might be teaching about volcanoes, and you're going to teach them vocabulary words such as lava or debris or crust. Those types of words, those are Tier 3. They're domain specific. The kids need them to understand that subject of what they're learning. So it's kind of interesting to look back on the words that you may teach in vocabulary and place them in the different tiers. There's some activities that you can do, even in examples on this Appendix A, that shows you examples of stories, and they've highlighted different words to the different tiers. Tier 2 are ones that they're words and they can access to complex text. These are the kind of words that we need to help our students expand their vocabulary. So Tier 2 is basically what you want to focus most of your attention on. There's a strong connection between vocabulary knowledge and comprehension. So they need to have that background on what those words mean before they can comprehend it in the text. They can sometimes figure them out from the context clues, but having that background is pretty important too. Just reviewing the definition is not sufficient. Giving them paper and pencil and having them write their definition, they don't necessarily understand what the definition is sometimes. Knowledge about words has many dimensions. To know a word means knowing what it means, how it's related to other words, how to pronounce it, and how to use it in a sentence. So a student doesn't fully understand a word until they can use it in sentences or in everyday speech. Spencer points out that in content areas, new words and concepts are central to instruction, and thus students need to learn specific meanings to understand the terms when they hear and use them correctly in both oral and written communication, and to remember them over time. So that's really the goal, is we want them to remember and use these words over time, not just for social studies class or science class. We want them to bring this vocabulary with them and use it in their daily lives. Another strategy is working on comprehension with your students. An important factor is implementing Bloom's taxonomy to ensure higher order thinking. One activity that I've come across that I think is really helpful is taking the Bloom's taxonomy. They've turned them into verbs, so they tell you what the kids should be doing. And just start at the bottom and create a question for your students using that verb. Like, for example, you might have them to describe something, or have them compare and contrast, and see how far up they can go, or that'll help you assess what critical skills they are using. Use open-ended questions. The simple multiple choice and matching, they don't make our students really think. A lot of times they can just guess on that type of question. So using open-ended questions where they have to explain and use citing from the text, that's when we can truly see if they're understanding. Teach text structures, mostly with the non-fictional text. There's different types of structures that are different from narrative, like the story elements. Non-fictional texts don't necessarily have those story elements, so there's different strategies for each one. Help them make connections from text to text. You can use graphic organizers. This helps them to organize the information and see it in a different aspect rather than just in paragraph form. You can do question-answer relationship, anticipation guides before you start a unit, literature circles, have students work with one another. You can do KWLs. These are pretty popular, and you can do paired reading, either with you and a student or student to student. You also need to include writing activities. Writing is included in the term literacy, so we need to get our students writing more also. When they're exposed to that non-fictional reading, it's going to help in terms of their writing and vice versa. Help them to analyze text and put it into their own words. This makes students own it and have the ability to communicate with others on this topic. Some activities you can do is have students write letters, they can keep a journal, do learning logs. You can have a classroom blog site where you assign maybe once a week they have to go on and blog about something they learned, or they can do exit slips. This keeps them all in check and responsible for their own learning. After I did all this research on this literature, I did some action research, which means me as the teacher did some research with my kids in my classroom to see if certain strategies benefit them. So that was the point. I was trying to learn if teaching text structures and informational text would help them to comprehend the information better. I did this during the RTI period at the end of the day, and I had 11 students. I think 6 were female and 5 were male. What I did before I gave any instruction on it is I gave them a non-fictional story to read and gave them like a little pre-test. And as you can see from the results here, the majority of them did not pass the test. It was a little bit harder for them. Now keep in mind this is a co-taught classroom, so they struggle with reading anyways, but the majority of them were not able to pass. After I gave the pre-test, I did some instruction. We spent a week or two, and we started with talking about what text structures are and how they relate to informational text. And then we started working with graphic organizers. Like we would pick a story and we would talk about cause and effect, and we'd fill out a graphic organizer on the story that has cause and effect. We did some sequencing where it was an event that took place and they wrote down the events that happened in order. We did compare and contrast. We did some Venn diagrams, and they were able to do these. After I did some instruction, I gave them opportunity to do some on their own, and I found that when they took the information from the text and put it on these graphic organizers, they could look back at their graphic organizer, and it helped them a lot more with understanding what it was they read, because they were picking out the important information. So after I did instruction with them, they went back and they read that same story from the first time, and they took another test, the same test. And this time around, you can see that only 3 people failed out of the 11, and the rest of them scored 70, 80, and I even had one score 90%. So what does this mean? Basically, from my findings, I know it was only on one test or one story, but I did find that they were able to comprehend it more. They were trying to think, I could hear them thinking out loud or asking questions about what type of structure it had, and they would look for headings and subheadings and the captions, and they would use those to aid them rather than to confuse them, because I asked them in the beginning and they were all confused about why is that picture there? Why is this chart here? They didn't know how it all correlated back to the text. So, in your room, if you teach reading or whether you don't, you should have an ideal reading program. This is one that I, from all my research, gathered together and kind of put together. The first thing is, it begins with a highly qualified teacher. So the teacher herself or himself needs to be able to understand the standards. And one way we can do this, since these are new to all of us, is through much more professional development. And use Bloom's taxonomy. Anytime you're doing any type of teaching, this is always important. Here's a visual as to the different verbs that they've turned it into. Like starting at the bottom, they've named it remembering. And some of the verbs are recalling information, or listing, or describing. So if you're having your students doing that, they're not using the most critical thinking skills. The next one up is understanding, and some of the verbs, they're summarizing, paraphrasing, classifying, or explaining. Then we get to applying, and the verbs there are implementing, or carrying out, or executing a task. Once we pass applying, we start getting into the higher order thinking. This is where we want all of our students to be at. They're analyzing, so they're comparing and organizing and deconstructing and finding information. Evaluating, they're hypothesizing, they're critiquing, they're experimenting, they're judging. And then the one at the top is creating. And the verbs for that would be they're designing something, or constructing, or producing, or inventing. So when we get into creating, that's when we're really making thinkers of our students. Here's something to consider in your classroom. This is a man named Dufour, and he actually came up with 4 questions. The first is, what is it we want our students to learn? What are the knowledge, skills, and dispositions we expect each student to acquire as a result of each unit we teach in language arts? Number 2 is, how will we know if our students are learning? What evidence will we gather and consider collectively to monitor the learning of each of our students? Number 3 is, how will we respond when students don't learn? Do we have a process in place that ensures students are provided an additional time and support for learning in a timely, directive, and systematic way that does not deprive students of access to new direct instruction? And the last question to consider is, how will we enrich and extend the learning for students who have demonstrated proficiency? So we need to think about kids that need help and kids that need challenged. Make sure you differentiate your instruction. This creates the best learning experiences for your students. It reaches all types of learners. It offers multiple pathways to learning. We know that not all of our students learn the same way, so if we differentiate, we'll hit on more of our students, and hopefully they can all find the way that they learn best. It keeps students engaged. It gives them the responsibility for their own learning. Make sure you teach literacy skills cross-curricular. I know I've mentioned this several times, but this is something that really needs to be stressed. All teachers are responsible for literacy skills that are critical to their subject. Motivate your students. Offer them choices. Engage them in challenging tasks. This will lead them to new discoveries. Provide students with some control over their learning. This is difficult for a lot of teachers because we know what we want our students to learn and we give them the pathway to get there. But what they really want is for them to have control over their own learning. So we need to set up situations where they can do this. Allow working in collaboration. This is a skill they're going to need as they go into the real world. They need to be able to work with others and communicate as well. Remember, motivation is multidimensional, and the students fluctuate in their motivational profiles. So what motivates one may not motivate the others. Incorporate technology. The Common Core states that you need to employ technology thoughtfully to enhance their reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language use. We are living in a technological age, and most of our students know more than we do. So there's where you can go to them and give them control over what they're learning, and they can teach us how to use it. Technology requires higher levels of thinking. That's where they're creating and building things, and it employs the multiple intelligences. The last thing that you need to have in your ideal reading program is to include the 5 pillars of literacy. Phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Now, in the upper grades, we're not going to be focusing as much on the phonics and the phonemic awareness, but fluency can always be worked on. Vocabulary, I've stressed how important that is, and comprehension. That's something that they need help with till they leave us. And you also need to include writing activities. It's very important that they become thinkers and express and communicate what they've learned on their own. So just remember, integrate literacy strategies in all areas, challenge your students to use critical thinking, and think of the bigger picture in life and help prepare your students for what's to come. Thank you guys for coming, and